Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. Now, I've got a confession to make. I am one of those cyclists who occasionally runs red lights. Now, I'm not proud of it. I try not to be reckless, but I definitely do it. And here's the interesting thing. I only do it when I'm in one of the two cities that I live in, and that is in London. When I'm cycling in Munich, I absolutely don't. Same activity, same bike, different city, different compliance. So what on earth is going on? Now, if you're a fellow Londoner, you've probably either run a red light yourself as a cyclist, or if not, you've seen it happen. And if you're listening from somewhere else, maybe in Munich, maybe in Mumbai, you might recognise your own version of this, a technically illegal act that can feel, in the moment, almost justifiable. And that's what we're exploring in this episode, because I came across a fascinating piece of behavioural science research that explored why cyclists in London, like me, run red lights. The study was commissioned by Lime, the electric bike and scooter company that operates in cities all over the world, and conducted by the team at Things Insight. I thought this was a fascinating study to look at because this seemingly simple behaviour, cycling through a red light on a bike, turns out to be a brilliant case study in compliance, risk perception, habit, social pressure and context. And of course, it's not just relevant to London, even though that's a city where this is quite prevalent. There are patterns that we can see in cities and systems everywhere. Joining me to explore this and explain the research they were involved in are Ella Jenkins, who's an associate director at Things Insight, and a first-time guest on the show, and Pete Dyson, who you may remember from a previous episode, who's a behavioural science researcher at the University of Bath, and interestingly, bicycle mayor of the city of Bath, and co-author with Rory Sutherland of the fabulous book Transport for Humans. There's a link to Pete's previous appearance on the show notes if you want to check that out. Now, what I love about this conversation is that while it's rooted in the specific act of red light running by cyclists in London, it opens up a much broader set of questions. How do we justify bending rules? How does our environment shape what we see as acceptable? And what does all of this tell us about how to design better, more effective compliance interventions? Stand by for a fascinating discussion on a fascinating topic. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, you will know that I am a huge fan of compliance in the wild, real-world situations that we can learn from. And it doesn't get much more compliance in the wild than this. So please enjoy, as I know you will. It's my discussion with Ella Jenkins and Pete Dyson on cyclists running red lights in London. Ella and Pete, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Very good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
And look, it's lovely to have you both there. Pete, you're a returning guest, so I'm going to get you to talk about the things that you've been doing subsequent to the last time we heard from you. But Ella, this is your first time on the show. Tell my listeners a little bit about yourself.
Of course. So I am an associate director in the behavioural science team at Things Insight. So I specialise in understanding what makes people do the things they do, and then using that understanding to design behavioural change interventions across all sorts of areas, from health, sustainability, to infrastructure, transport, and even consumer behaviour too.
Amazing. And Pete, you were on the show when we talked about your fabulous book that you co-authored with the wonderful Rory Sutherland called Transport for Humans. Link to that in the show notes. But since then, you've moved and you're doing something that's relevant to the conversation we're about to have. What have you moved on to do since we last spoke?
Yeah, I now am at the University of Bath, where I'm doing a PhD on travel behaviour, looking at social norms and travel behaviour. But in my spare time that I have, I'm also volunteering as bicycle mayor for Bath. Bicycle mayor, a network around the world, 150 cities, and Bath has one, and I'm taking that position at the moment. Which means trying to encourage people to cycle in all its different forms. So I've taken my passion for cycling and amped it up a notch.
Love it. And that's relevant to the topic we're talking about. And I guess to introduce this, Ella, I saw something that you posted on LinkedIn which resonated with me, which was some research into what makes people, and I include myself categorically in this, what makes cyclists in London jump through red lights. How did that come about?
Yeah, so we were approached by Lime via the PR company Headland to try and understand the behavioural drivers, so what was really making cyclists in London do these unsafe behaviours. So why were they running through red lights, and what could be done to prevent them doing this?
So obviously Pete comes into play because of his expertise and interest in cycling.
I suppose so. I'm a gun for hire in that respect. Keen to chip in, and I think it's helpful in behavioural science to have some specialism. And I think as Ella and the team and I found, travel behaviour research can be useful to get into how you talk about trips and journeys and all that sort of thing. But yeah, we're going to bound to talk about red light running is a significant issue in a lot of different ways, and it's worthwhile to tackle.
What I loved about it was, as I said, my own personal curiosity, because I admit I do it. Obviously, I have very good reasons for doing it, but there are some other irresponsible people that might do it for less good reasons. But it's a fascinating topic to tackle because we all know that we shouldn't do it, and yet we do. Or some of us do. I'm sure there are some people that don't ever do it. How do you even start about thinking about tackling that topic?
So what we did from a research point of view is we needed to understand what was driving this behavior. And we needed to try and understand it not just by asking people, why do you do it, but by gathering that insight using behavioral science. So trying to get them to imagine a scenario where they might be approaching a red light and what goes through their mind, what are they looking out for? And also asking them to imagine different types of contexts, because we know that it's so often the context that drives the behavior. And when you're making that split-second decision in the moment, you're not just relying on what you know from the law, but you're relying on the situation, the people around you, and there's lots of different factors that influence that decision.
And as you start to look at it, what was the process that you went through in terms of identifying people? Because not all cyclists are the same, right? There are people that cycle for different reasons. And I'm assuming the remit here wasn't just to look at people on rental bikes, but was to look at the topic as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. So we first of all did a survey with 1,000 cyclists. And the remit to be included the cyclist was you had to cycle at least monthly. So we're talking about semi-regular cyclists, people who are familiar with the roads and who aren't just doing it once or twice a year. We also took a smaller sample of London cyclists into some focus groups. And in that group, we included people who are younger. So we have some groups of younger cyclists, older cyclists, as well as delivery drivers, people who are cycling for work, and people who use a range of different bikes. So as you mentioned, those rental bikes, but also personal bikes, or even borrowing friends' bikes. So trying to get a range of different people and trying to understand, is there any differences between them, or is it more about the context and the environment in the moment?
So what sort of questions are you asking them? Because, I was joking earlier about my rationale for doing it. Is this about asking people whether, I guess the first question is, do you do it, I presume? And then you get into why you do or don't do it.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to be quite clever with how you ask the do you do it question. So one thing we did, particularly in the survey, was hide that question within a number of other cycling related behaviours. So things like cycling while drunk, not wearing a helmet, and also just general kind of cycling behaviours that aren't perhaps deemed risky. And that helps you tease out a little bit more of the real understanding of how many people are really doing it or not. So we did ask about whether people do it. We also asked the types of situations they might be more likely to do it, what they think their friends might think of it, or what their friends might do in similar situations, to try and get them away from that socially desirable response and get closer to the truth. And then we critically asked about, we would call them interventions, but things that might make them less likely to do it. So we asked about things like road design, enforcement, and other types of interventions that might be more effective or less effective.
And I love the idea about talking about other misdemeanors, for whatever, or bits of misconduct, because I guess if you left that as the totality and it became a binary thing between running red lights and being sensible, that you'd be missing some of the nuance there. And I'm guessing, Pete, when we look at sort of cyclists' adherence to regulations, there's a broad range of things that people can do that's, let's be slightly flippant with it, that's naughty.
Yeah, well, we were talking there about social desirability bias of people disclosing different activities or having certain characteristics when they respond to research, and that's why people are endlessly fascinating to research, and you have to be sympathetic to their situation. In cycling, you end up with a mixture of things that are, well, in the UK highway code, that are shoulds and musts. The adherence to traffic signals are a must. You'll be breaking the law, and in the UK, the consequences are a get away with a caution, or you can receive a several £100 fine. Notably, you don't have points on your driving license. You also have a driving license. But then there are other aspects of cycle behavior that are bundled in there that are more about shoulds and more about things that are more about etiquette and more considerate road user behavior. And I think in some situations, people are interpreting traffic signals to be shoulds rather than must.
And there's something interesting about this group of people because it's deliberately designed in this way, right? It's an accessible activity. So the barrier to entry is, do you have a bike? It's not, there's no qualifications required. There's no training that's required as such. And therefore, unlike driving a car where you will, assuming you're driving legally, you will have a license. You'll have to go through various processes to get there. Cycling is designed to get people into the activity. So you want the barrier to entry to be relatively non-existent. But that's an interesting dynamic there where anybody can do this. And therefore, that's why you get, I guess, some of these different behaviors because you've got different levels of experience, different frequencies of doing it. In a way, it's quite a large population that you could be looking at.
Yeah, well, now we're entering into some more sensitive topics, about barriers to entry for cycling. Probably worth saying is on some stats, the vast majority of people do have a cycle proficiency course they're taught as a child. The highway code and the road rules are disseminated to children and young people, in fact, whether they end up cycling or not, even if they're pedestrian. And then to say among cyclists, I don't have a London statistic to hand, but 83% of people who cycle in the UK also have a driving license. So will have likely done a theory test and a highway code piece. And while we're on the sort of topic of rule breaking, as you know, simply educating someone on the highway code or requiring them to be behind a wheel does not necessarily guarantee they're going to adhere to all road rules. So when people drive vehicles, they also misdemeanors in terms of traffic signals and many other things. So in a way, humans are being human, but in this case, we're talking about two wheels with pedals and sometimes electric assist.
So what were some of the things that you found out in these, particularly in the interviews? What were the sorts of things you were discovering there?
So one thing that was really interesting, which definitely surprised me, was that it wasn't necessarily the inexperienced cyclists that were being reckless and running through red lights, but it was completely the opposite. So it was actually the more frequent, confident cyclists who are more likely to run the red lights, which perhaps goes against the common belief that was definitely seen online. So did some social listening, and people tend to blame kind of inexperienced, reckless, maybe teenagers for running through red lights. But actually we found that it's those people who are doing it on their frequent journeys to work, when they feel like really, really confident and really familiar with the road, which tells us that it's really a classic example of the overconfidence bias and the fact that these experienced cyclists believe they can safely judge when to run through the red lights, perhaps at the expense of underestimating the actual risk involved. So that came through really strongly in the different focus groups where we had the less frequent cyclists saying they're too scared to run through the red lights, and the more frequent cyclists saying that they kind of do it more habitually as part of their routine.
I guess that there is a certain logic to that, right? It's that the more I've done something, the more I do understand the environment. I've seen lots of things, whisper, I've got away with it in the past and nothing happened. So there is a basic human logic that says this experience is valuable to me and therefore I know what I'm doing and therefore that's okay. The flip side, of course, is the overconfidence that you pointed out. And it certainly parallels a lot of the work that I've done where you kind of get senior people who think compliance rules are for junior people. These are the people who don't know what they're doing. They need the rules because they know what they're doing, whereas I'm an expert and therefore I can sort of see them, understand them, but ignore them because I'm an expert. So it's fascinating the disconnect between the perception. And I guess this is partly why Lime were interested in doing it, because I presume a large part of the perception is that here's some reckless people that jumping on bikes don't know what they're doing and therefore running lights. Whereas if you did know what you were doing, you of course wouldn't run that risk. And what you're demonstrating here is that public perception is wrong.
Yeah, I think particularly when we looked at the social listening findings, we used a tool which allowed us to analyze the sentiment. And all the mentions of red light running came out as very highly emotional, with anger being the most common tone being identified. And that was even among cyclists themselves who are talking about it online. And it suggests that there's that mismatch, as I said, so between the people who are actually red light running and who's being blamed online. So being blamed online was people like delivery drivers, teenagers, reckless people, whereas we found that it was a bit more complex when you dug into it in a number of different ways.
Yeah, and I think now's a really interesting time to be studying red light running and to give zoom out a bit with some context. we also find ourselves, I think, at a nexus of cycling suddenly becoming to the fore as tool to combat climate change, but also for urban renewal. Yes, I think we were talking about this 10 years ago. People might have had a more stereotypical image of what a cyclist is, and to some extent that continues. But the image, certainly in cities, of what a cyclist looks like and how experienced they are is definitely changing. And I can't speak to know exactly of Lime's motivations for funding the research, but we can see that there's a new context where there's this new kid on the block. It's called an e-bike, and it's a ride share thing, and you don't have to own a bike anymore to have access to regular cycling to get around. And it's growing the pursuit. So new people is attracting new people into cycling. This might get into it. The e-bike technology gives you a little bit of oomph and a bit of power, but obviously the people who rent that out now for the first time have some responsibility and some clear interest in the way that Peugeot bikes of the 1970s would happily sell you a nice little road bike, but nobody expected them to necessarily have clear stake in how it was ridden. Lime and many other rideshare providers have this equipment, and they want it to be, and they need it to be used safely in order to expand the schemes and run them well, and let this be a really good form of transport.
And that is really interesting, isn't it? Because as you say, it's branded. If there's a problem with somebody on a rental bike, that does go back to the rental company in a way that if just a plain manual, we don't, to your point, if someone buys a Porsche and speeds in it, we don't blame Porsche for we might ultimately say they shouldn't be making cars that go that quickly, but typically we're blaming the driver. In this particular scenario, when we look at there is a linkage between the rider's behavior and the rental bike company, which isn't necessarily fair. And yet that's sort of what sticks. And I guess if you brand particularly well, which clearly they're very distinctive, then that's going to raise that challenge. So that's a really, really interesting point. So you started to talk a lot about the process. You've done some interviews, sort of got a sense of it. We've had a look at what people, the sort of the general public are recognizing, of course, that what people say on socials is you're unlikely to see posts of people going, I saw some well-behaved cyclists today, right? Because that's not sort of social media worthy. So it's one particular angle, but it is an observation as to what we've seen going on. What else did you discover as you were having those initial conversations?
Yeah, so we also found that whilst it's not all about being confident and kind of speeding to get to work, sometimes red light running can be a defensive move. So some cyclists did tell us that they need to run the red lights in order to get away from danger. And that was perhaps more of the inexperienced cyclists. So feeling like they were being boxed in by lorries in really busy junctions, or having no clear cycle spaces to wait safely. And that made people feel quite on edge and nervous, and therefore running the red light was seen as the safer thing to do to get them out of the way of something worse that could happen. So it's almost maybe judged as kind of the least worst decision in a poorly designed system.
And so the argument there would be I had no choice. Right? I felt
Yeah.
like the environment that I was in drove me that particular behavior. So because I'm always fascinated by the rationale, because you could see an argument saying I needed to get to my destination quicker is driven by you, whereas this environment was implicitly wasn't designed in a way that made me safe, and therefore I had no choice but to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. It isn't, and it's not just the physical environment as well. It was also the social environment. So often people were saying, well, I'm in a big group of cyclists and everyone else is running through the red light. Why don't we want to be the one that's left waiting? That feels like I'm doing the wrong thing. So using other people's behavior as a cue for how to behave as well is definitely seen as an influence.
And what sorts of language are people using when they respond to this? Because I'm fascinated by, and I guess maybe the speed, do these excuse, I don't want to sound negative because I'm sort of thinking about what I would say, but the language that people use and the ability to rationalize it, is that something that comes quickly to people? In other words, could they immediately tell you the sorts of things, or did it require a moment of reflection? And I'm not suggesting that a moment of reflection necessarily makes it more suspicious, but I'm just intrigued as to people's ability to grab rationale. Was that relatively easy, or did they have to reflect on it?
That is a really good question. I think it was relatively easy for people to admit they did it. It wasn't necessarily seen as a awful thing to do. I mean, just like yourself has said, you're guilty on occasion of doing it. I think it's not necessarily seen as the worst crime in the world. I think there's probably the reasons they became a little bit quicker to the people who did it more often, just saying that I know I can safely do it. I'm confident in my ability. And perhaps the people who did it less often took a bit more time to understand the other reasons why they might be doing it. But I think probably some of the main insight is that it was just seen as a behaviour they do occasionally when the situation is right.
Yeah, and I think we find in a lot of behavioral science research, it's hard for people to expect people's level of introspection on different aspects. So in the case of red light running, there is a wider body of literature of other people obviously have studied cycling behaviour, and they have found social influence effects, and they found more people impacted by social influence that are younger and less experienced cyclists, which sort of makes sense. Quite hard in a research method to necessarily expect people to jump straight into that level of confidence of studying a behaviour that comes relatively automatically. Although I think a critic would say you don't run a red light without noticing that you're doing it a bit, like it is visually, it's very salient, and you're making a choice whether you think about it or not. I think that's where you need the strength of this research is both a survey and a focus group depth method. And you might go even deeper, as other studies have done that, where observational studies can do a more experimental approach to having stooges or actors in order to manipulate in an environment that social norms effect, and they have found more people follow people across a red light. Partly, I think, because there's a sort of identity in it, and we might get a bit into this, that some people's identity is I'm not the type of person who waits for like a light while other people are flagrantly flouting the law, so I'll go through. And the other identity might be, safety in numbers. Probably that enforcement threat falls away if a crowd of people fly through a red light there, and they're not all going to be stopped and handed an enforcement notice. So there is safety in numbers, but I mean, that's not really a world not the world we necessarily want to live in. And this would probably be true of car drivers or all kind of other behaviours that we want to stay within the law for.
And I'm fascinated, Ella, you mentioned the fact that there's this prevalent narrative of, I don't do it all the time. In other words, either the truth or the excuse, and it could be both, of course. There's almost an implicit recognition that you shouldn't be doing it, but a sort of rationalization that is, I wouldn't always do it. So in other words, it's quite the way it's presented is selective non-compliance for good reason, as opposed to a two fingers up to the whole system. It's almost, there's an interesting respect for the system on some level, which says that I wouldn't do this all the time, but in these specific situations I can. And that strikes me as being quite an interesting narrative, because it's not a sort of anarchic response to the tyranny of traffic lights. It's a sort of thoughtful thing that says, well, I recognize that I should be doing this, but in limited circumstances, I can find myself not doing it.
Yeah, exactly that. And there was some situations where I pretty much say everyone agreed that it would be okay to run the red light. So, for example, it's late at night, there's no traffic on the roads, and there's like no pedestrians. There's kind of almost no reason to wait. But then there was other situations where people were a bit more on the fence, and whether it might be a bit safer to run the red light, but also it necessarily isn't quite, you're still introducing an element of risk there. So I think for some people it would come more naturally, and for others it's actually, they'd rather not break the rule unless they absolutely have to.
And I'd like to come in at this point, actually, and give another reason why listeners should listen carefully to Ella, not just because she's an excellent research director at Thinks, but also unusually in travel research, she's not actually a cycle user herself. And while we talk about, I talk a lot about personal lived experience being an important aspect of transport and research. In this case, when we're talking about red light running and other road users' behaviour, is it actually useful? In this case, Ellen doesn't ride a bike around London, like 10 or 15 years riding around. So comes with it both an ability to step outside of that thing. I think it can be useful in research to actually have a combination of people. In the world of active travel research, the vast majority of people do appear to be cyclists, and that colours or paints a picture of what it's like. Yeah. Anyway, if you've got any reflection on that, or I've spoken on your behalf of it, but it hasn't come up yet, but I think there's a nice contrast between lived experience and being a researcher on a topic.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think I found some of these insights absolutely fascinating because I haven't got that experience of cycling around London, looking at all the hazards and making those decisions. So I was really kind of soaking in what everyone was telling me. I think maybe it's that point around, I think I was quite surprised that it was the more frequent cyclists doing the red light running. Whereas perhaps, as you mentioned earlier, Christian, you were saying that has quite a lot of rationale to it because people know what they're doing and they can make confident, calculated decisions. So maybe I've been soaking in more of the online world of people getting angry at the rental bike users or the young teenagers. So maybe until you've got that lived experience of who's more likely to do it and the situations, you can soak in what other people are saying more, perhaps, until you do the depth research.
And I love that contrast you've brought out there beautifully, Pete, because I think there's something really interesting about, my approach to this whole conversation is skewed around my own personal beliefs, experiences, and motivated reasoning for why I do it. And so I love this idea of you need the inside track. It's almost the thing that's often missing, right? Which is sort of you either have somebody that really understands it, but then the more you understand, the more you're blind because chances are you're participating on some level to understand it. So that independent perspective, I think, is fascinating. Combining the two, I think, is super interesting. And I'd never really thought about that. Clearly, we can't always do it, but that's a really helpful kind of balancing act there to bring in that external perspective, because I think then you might ask some questions in a different way or look at it in a much more dispassionate way. So I think that's a really, really interesting point. Has doing this whole thing changed your perspectives, Ella, in terms of whether you would want to cycle or not, your views on cyclists? Because you've obviously learned some things by doing this in a way that somebody that cycles might not have.
Yeah, I think on one hand, it makes me a little bit nervous when you speak to the groups of less experienced cyclists and they talk about some horror stories of being at really busy junctions and having a huge lorry behind you and feeling really pressured. That probably doesn't feed into my anxiety that well. But then on the other hand, you speak to cyclists who do it day in, day out and love it and love the experience of riding around London and the freedom that gives you. And when we were designing our interventions, we got quite into that process and trying to see cycling as almost a mindful activity, and how when we were kind of deciding how we could try and get people to really enjoy the process of waiting at red lights, that was quite a nice experience to try and think about your journey home as being a mindful experience where you have a couple of minutes of pause of reflection at the red lights. And that on the other hand makes me feel more excited about cycling, as thinking of it as a kind of enjoyable activity in that sense. So yeah, we'll have to watch this space and see whether I get on a bike actually over the next few months.
Intriguing. And you've mentioned the interventions. What else should we pull out from the findings before we look at what your sort of proposals were?
Well, one of the findings when we're on it that I think is an interesting one is just distribution among cyclists. And it's a type of analysis which can be just change the lens and the way you look at it. So in a survey you're collecting, in this case, let's say 1,000 people's responses, you then find out their stated frequency of red light running. But then if we report only that, if the problem we're trying to deal with is problems at junction, there are traffic lights being, rules being broken, we miss the fact that some people cycle further and some people cycle more often than others. So it's this kind of thing in sort of consumer research about like the heavy consumers consume the vast majority of all of your product. So in the study, we described the assumptions and the coding of the questions to bring this to life. But you multiply effectively somebody's frequency of red light running with how often they even do cycling and then how far they typically cycle. Clearly, if you only cycle once a month and you go for a mile or two, you're not ever going to be contributing to this problem in a particularly huge way. Whereas even if you red light run occasionally, but you're cycling every day at long distances, and clearly that's going to make a bigger effect. So we get that, listeners might be familiar with that like Pareto curve or this sort of curve of cumulative amounts of red light running, which I think stood out to me. It's interesting that way it's not evenly distributed. So the top, I'll put it this way, 50% of people are responsible for almost none of the red light running. 75% of people account for just about 9% of red light running. and that top 10% are doing like 2/3 for the red light run. So it's sort of it is a bit of a bad apple description that when you do it, that kind of analysis, you see if you really want to tackle the problem, worth trying to intervene and shape the behavior of some of the most frequent worst offenders, rather than try and tackle an overall population approach. That said, we need a mechanism for working out why these people emerge where they do, and they might have started out as inexperienced, infrequent cyclists and wrapped it up from there. But it's a nice type of analysis. I think it's done in other areas of consumer research, as I say, and also in sort of availability and inequality studies that looking at like carbon emissions, find that the highest polluters are responsible for a high proportion of all emissions, that sort of thing. That lens helps us understand compliance or how we might intervene, I think, in a few different ways, and maybe we're about to get into that intervention shortly.
But that's really interesting, because you're not targeting an average cyclist, because there may be no such thing when you talk about lengths of journeys and propensities to do things. And so as you look at it, those numbers, the stats you get, very, very stark, that if you could tackle that small percentage of people, then you would solve the majority of the problem. And so the temptation with these things often is to do a sort of one size fits all average. Let's target everybody. And so I think that's a really interesting way of looking at a compliance challenge, is to say that, yes, there's a rule breaking stat, but that doesn't neatly break down into, and as I think about somebody on a longer journey, there may be different junctions where different rationale apply. And so we also have to look at the different environments. So when we look at you look at the overriding problem as being, here's one thing, but actually when we start to break it down to, these are different crossings or junctions, different cyclists, different rationale. And so that's a really interesting, as we come on to talk about the interventions, that's just worth bearing in mind, because this isn't a straightforward sort of everybody does it, or the rationale is always the same, or a general campaign is going to cut it. You're really looking at targeting that very specific thing. So with that said, what did you conclude? What were some of the ideas you came up with?
I can do a bit of an overview, but so we really highlighted 3 key areas which needed to be considered. So the first being education. And that was based on the insight that 13% of the people we spoke to didn't actually know that it was illegal. So that does suggest that there's some opportunity here to remind people that this is an offence, and perhaps tackling that optimism bias they might have, that nothing bad will happen, or no one's watching them, and there's kind of no issues here.
But that's really interesting, right? Because of all the excuses one could come up with, that sort of, for me, is closest to the implausible. Because you kind of go, why do you think it wouldn't apply?
Yeah,
it is. I think we might be at the border of like musts versus shoulds in people's interpretation of it. I would challenge people to necessarily know whether they must follow the green man on a pedestrian light, or whether that's advisory. I think most people know that it's advisory. They're not breaking the law. But in some countries, you're breaking the law. So I've dug into that as well. Even if you just took people who grew up in another country or in the UK, they might not necessarily know that the law follows like that for red lights here.
And I guess you could also, there's a point here stretching, well, I know it's illegal, but it's sort of tolerated, a little bit like if you're in a car, there's that perception that you can have 10% over the speed limit plus 1 mile an hour and nothing will happen to you. Now, whether that's true or not is another matter, but there is this perception that the law, yes, it's a sort of red and green to use the colours, but actually maybe there's a bit of flex. So I can sort of see a liberal interpretation of what the rules, the spirit of the law, I guess, rather than the letter of it. So maybe we could be generous and say it's that kind of interpret. It doesn't seem that bad a thing. If a car did it, that would be terrible, but cycling, therefore that. So, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so back to you, Ella. That just fascinated me.
Yeah, no, definitely. The second one was infrastructure, because there's so many potential environments where this is more likely. And because whilst London's really designed it's been more and more designed in a way that's set up for cyclists, there still was a lot of consensus among cyclists that more protected bike lanes, better waiting spaces, and also cycle-specific lights could be factors that would make them feel safer on the roads, and therefore less likely to want to red light run to get away from danger. And then finally, enforcement. So despite the fact that not everyone knows it's legal, pretty much everyone feels that harsher fines or stronger enforcement would be effective in preventing red light running. So I think it was 72% of cyclists wanted to see more kind of policing of this as a crime, and they feel that would be a deterrent. and maybe not just for themselves, but for other cyclists in general.
You talked about the environment there, and Pete, I guess this plays into your current work. Because one of the things that strikes me is that there's an irony here that the more infrastructure you put in place, that makes that bit safer. But when you don't have that infrastructure, then suddenly, there's lots of examples you think of where you're in a segregated lane and suddenly you're thrown out into the traffic, particularly at a moment that's quite terrifying because the funding has not been there, or it's difficult to do that bit, or you cross a local authority and suddenly the next local authority hasn't picked up, whatever that happens to be. So there's quite an interesting challenge here of saying, that in a way, the more you make certain bits safer, the more you make it obvious that others potentially aren't or don't feel as safe.
Yeah, well, this is a big topic. We're going to go even wider than we'll have time for on travel behaviour and shared space and urban design. Has been going on for sort of decades. The UK's first sort of one was, for some trivia, was down in South Kensington. Those that know the museum quarter, the sort of bit between the Natural History Museum and the Science Museum, of all this urban form where pedestrians and vehicles sort of blur into one, and the thought is people pay more attention when they're not segregated into certain areas. But I think it's generally accepted that doesn't scale to much, and it's not desirable the whole of our roads and highways where the dotted white lines proves to be very helpful. But then we get into areas there of also segregating on like where the bicycle should live, and is it this awkward thing that shouldn't be with pedestrian, but also shouldn't be with motorized traffic, and that's where sort of segregation goes with separate bike paths. And in some forms, it looks like separate bike paths are really essential if you're going to be serious about growing cycling as a wide form of transport. It's not just the UK is saying this, that's where any cycling nation or region that has a lot of participation has segregated lane. Exactly how they're segregated and what I think you might get excited about, like what form of safety or interpretation of segregation new and experienced cyclists want. So in one form, it's this built-up curb where a vehicle is really unlikely to ever make contact with you. In the UK, we have the emergency active travel measures during COVID, which sprung up lots of little bike lanes, but sometimes with little one sort of like little wobbly poles, really, which didn't inspire enough people with that much. It didn't really meet threshold of like perception of safety or quality of bike lane that inspire enough people to cycle, and that's why the standard has sort of improved. I think Ella and I, in our background in behavioural science, we get quite excited about infrastructure design, right down to the design and the brightness of the light, or the solid line marking out that this is a sort of line you should not cross, or bike box waiting area, or the cycle early release lights, which strike me as quite a smart way in which you're accounting for the fact that cyclists get for sort of 5 seconds to get away from the lights to get up and running. We did see in our examples, didn't we, of a little hand-holding rail that you can hold on to if the lights are on a steep hill. I think in Bristol, they've recently installed this. So cyclists, you don't even need to dismount. You're holding onto sort of a handrail, and it means your feet are already on the pedals and you can move away at the lights. Otherwise, it's quite an effort to keep moving. But I really like that ergonomic kind of approach.
And what I like about that and some of the other design things you've talked about is that it's sort of happening subtly. And so when we look at certain intervention, a traffic light is an attempt to communicate a rule to people and how when that rule is applying, not applying. So it's quite sort of feels quite forced and is obvious. Things like the handrails or the way things are designed is much more subtle. And I like some of that thinking because I think it leaves you're always going to have those sort of big punchy interventions that say this is what the rule is. But actually, we can do a lot with subtle things that people might not even notice. They'll just use it as part of the thing. And so the smart interventions always strikes me is go in that direction. So I love that illustration, Pete. So really, if I pull all these things together, the kind of conclusion that you've reached is that there are some understandable reasons there. And unsurprisingly, there isn't one silver bullet that's going to solve this. There's a range of different interventions, many of which go to environment, but some of which, to your point around fines or enforcement, go to slightly different motivations. But it's really looking at that complete toolkit. There isn't one thing that's going to solve it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fact that it's quite a complex picture in terms of the elements that are driving the behaviour leads you naturally to the idea that there's not going to be a silver bullet, but there needs to be a range of different things, because a range of different things will be effective for different types of cyclists and different people in different environments, which perhaps isn't the easy solution. But I think we really spoke with Lyman other stakeholders and trying to involve different groups in this journey. So involving cycling groups, involving local councils, involving the rental e-bike providers. It feels like a joined up effort is needed to try and tackle it in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and I think people, if we had further research on enforcement, it would be a good sort of deliberative piece for people to think. You need to take outside of transport to what is an effective or an understandable use of police time. So there are statistics on the number of traffic light infringement enforcements done in the City of London each year, and it goes up and it goes down. And if you're interested, it's about 5,000 or so across a year, quite a big number. But then, given the size of challenges the police force are facing and the other crimes they might be forcing or other traffic infringements they might be looking at, you might either that's a good use of police time or a poor use of police time. To some extent, we leave it up to the police force and the police commissioner to decide how they spend their time and what they want to do. I think the balance is probably about right. If you had no enforcement, then it would lead to it would remove one of those important barriers. But if they spend a lot of time doing it, it might not be an effective use of their time. But it'd be good to put that to the public and then in the round speak about the other things that police force could be doing.
As we talk about this subject, and Pete, you talked about identity earlier. I mean, there's a lot of emotion around this. And if I looked at it, sort of, there's the emotion of the cyclist, there's the emotion of pedestrians, there's the emotion of other road users. And so I think one of the interesting things here, and this is why I find this study fascinating, is that it adds to the whole, I guess, misconception sometimes of what the reality is, because I have a fixed view on this. I have observed this, and you can observe what's happening, but you can't necessarily observe the rationalization in the moment. But you can have strong feelings about it, and you can have strong feelings whether you're involved in this or not. And I think it's a really interesting example of where we need to dig underneath it to understand whether the preconceptions around the non-compliance are valid. And so I love the fact that you've dissected that. So for me, this is a really interesting illustration of I guess what I'm saying is this is much more complicated than it might first seem.
One area is complicated, and I think there's a lot of stigma or controversy would be something like delivery drivers, because that's a sector that's grown really, really quickly. We now have a lot of bike couriers, and in some sense that's great. It's moving things from van to bicycle and more people and town and city friendly way of moving things about. But it has grown traffic counts a lot there, but it's also a sector that has other preconceived knowledges about the gig economy, about regulation, about unregulated e-bikes, or things that now tend to be called e-motorbikes, or passing off as e-bikes. But the real rub of it, and the tragedy from a sort of systems approach, is that those delivery companies pay their drivers based on the deliveries they might do in a given shift. And if they don't enforce, or they're able to move through red light running, those people are then almost expected, in order to make their earnings, to hit a certain target or a certain number of deliveries in a given hour. Then the only way they can do that is by red light running. And for me, that's the sort of real tragic systems approach where someone needs to intervene. And unfortunately, like say, if your business model relies on people driving illegal motorbikes through red lights, I'm afraid you don't have a business model in our country. But that's not for me to say it shouldn't be shut down, but like they need to work on regulation and safety, because otherwise it's gone a riot.
Yeah, and just to add on that, actually, we spoke to a delivery driver as part of the focus groups who told us that as a driver, you're not actually responsible for the fines. If you were to get caught riding through a red light and to get fined, he said that his company would pay that fine on his behalf. So there was no sense of kind of personal responsibility there, or kind of accountability. However, obviously we can't speak for all delivery companies. That was just one person's individual experience, but that's maybe something interesting, which could be further amplifying that motivation to get through the red lights without any consequences.
What you've both brought in there is fascinating, because that's another factor. It's like, why are you undertaking the journey? Because it's not just necessarily about the time or how often you do it. It's why are you doing it? What pressures? What are the other incentives that come into play? And so I was thinking about, if you've rented a bike, obviously it costs you money to be sat at the light. So that's an interesting other factor. So we can sort of see that, particularly where keeping your job or spending money or any of these sorts of dynamics might come into play, then almost what you do sort of deal with the environment or the other, you can't manage those as well. So one needs to think about those extraneous factors that can come into play. And I think often when we look at compliance, it's really convenient to sort of say, let's treat this as if we just look at the factors at play in this particular environment for this subset of the population, nice and easy. But humans are much more complex, right? We come with other things and other incentives. And of course, if it's to do with employment or to do with money that you're spending, that's going to have a factor on you that may have far greater impact than the environment that you're in.
Yeah, and funnily enough, we came in with the hypothesis that perhaps rental e-bike users might be more likely to red light run because of the money they're spending on hiring the bike. And when we did our survey, we found that saving money on a rental bike was the least common reason that people identified for red light running. So it ranked as the lowest motivator. Not to say that it's not motivator at all, but it was far, far less of an incentive than things like saving time, the idea that there's no danger if you do it or you're not going to get caught. So perhaps it might not be such a big influence of this behaviour. But yeah, hard to know.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Which is why you do these sorts of things. I think this is a really, really good example. And I would encourage any politicians or anybody with political aspiration or anybody sort of creating rules and incentive to think about these things, because I think this is a great illustration of we can presume why people do things, but actually it's much more complex. And this is why we all love behavioral science, right? Because it reveals sometimes the things that we would like to believe drive behavior don't actually.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason I love this, because it's almost you picked a topic that's really easy to understand, just in terms of what is the act of compliance, why does it matter? We haven't even bothered explaining why running red lights is a bad idea, because I didn't think it was necessary. It's kind of a given. So I love this as a compliance case study, because you've really unpicked it on here's a really simple behavior that looks like it ought to be simple and solvable, but actually the layer of complexity underlying it is enormous.
I'd love to do the same research on something like wearing a helmet or not driving drunk, things like that, which maybe other cycling safety type behaviours, and whether they've got similar motivators or completely different. Interesting to find out.
So one of my questions to you is, what's next? Is there anything else that's on the cards along those lines? Because I agree that would be interesting. I could see why it might be more challenging to go and research drunken cycling, for example, because that would raise all sorts of issues. That's a bit more hidden. Whereas this is a highly visible bit of non-compliance, and therefore it's probably easier to think. But I presume, is there anything in the offering on your side, Ella, that you can talk about?
Well, only in the sense that I know Lime themselves are pursuing some of these interventions. They are hopefully doing some communications type nudges within their platform, and also talking to some different cycling groups and local councils to try and get these things kind of into the real world. So we'll be keeping close contact with them to try and help wherever we can.
Was this a fun thing to do?
Yeah, really fun.
Because I know all behavioural science is fun, right? And every single thing you work on. But this one strikes me as being particularly intellectually interesting, but also practically interesting and just quite difficult to get a handle around. So there's a lot to play with.
Yeah, I loved it. I think it was one of those briefs that came in that instantly captured my attention and thought this would be really, really interesting to work on. I think for me, I really like behaviour change challenges where you have to try and change quite an ingrained habit. Because I think they're just the most kind of tricky ones to get your teeth into. And I think it's also one of those challenges where rationally people know they should be doing something, but behaviourally, because of the context and the situation, so many other things come into play. So that just means that you need so much more creativity to try and solve the challenge and think about it in lots of different ways. So yeah, absolutely one of those really fun challenges to work on.
And I'm fascinated, the people that you spoke to, and obviously this would be hard to prove, right? But was there a sense that in interviewing them, did you make them think more about so those of them that admitted to running red lights, did people sort of say that it had made them think about, because I'm thinking about sort of parallels and recognizing that they're not the same at all. But one of the solutions that we have to sort of speeding in a car is driver awareness courses, where the object is just to sort of highlight something and to make people think differently about it. And so I wondered here, even participating in your research, I wondered whether was there anything that you got back from people in terms of feedback saying, oh yeah, maybe I will think about it a bit more?
Yeah, I think so. Often when we do research like this, you're subtly changing the people that you speak to and their behaviour without necessarily trying to. And I think having some of the more frequent cyclists interact with people who perhaps were more nervous about red light running or more nervous about cycling, and thinking about the ways that it impacted them, particularly in the sense of kind of when everyone else is doing it, I feel like I have to do it, and how kind of pressured people think. I think that might have resonated with some people more.
what I was thinking about, the parallel for me is those surveys that sometimes people do about their product, where the survey is the ad, where you ask people about advertisements that they can't possibly have seen and said, have you seen these? And the idea is to put the brand in their mind, being parallel with some of these other things. And so it almost struck me that one of the interventions one could come up with is these sorts of discussions. Because you can tell people, but it's quite difficult to change preconceptions with a sort of top-down comms approach. Actually, a sort of social, viral, kind of conversational type thing could be very, very powerful here, particularly where you're dealing with very strongly held beliefs and preconceptions. Any other broader lessons that we can draw from this?
I think what came out as quite strongly in the focus groups was if people had had a bad experience themselves or had known someone else that had an accident or been fined, that was probably the biggest impact on their behaviour in terms of them changing from being a red light runner to a non-red light runner. But you kind of don't want to let it get that far, do you? You don't really want everyone to have accidents or everyone to get fines. So maybe there's something in the spreading of stories or making it feel more of an imminent threat to try and subtly get that message out there without causing lots of damage.
I love that. We learn from experiences, and if we haven't got that experience ourselves, other people's experiences can inform it. So I think that's a lovely way to think about that. One of the thoughts I had was, I wonder whether one could free one's imagination. Go, is there a different way that you could solve the original problem? Because we've inherited traffic lights as the logical way, and that has certain attractions because they're universal, people understand them, and so on and so forth. But actually, that's what's driving a lot of these things. So potentially, with a sort of creative mindset, is there another way to look at this? Because we're stuck with the constraints of traffic lights. So there may well be some interesting solutions. I don't know what they would be or how that might look that would take you away from that. If you wanted to look at blame it all on the environment, is there another way to do it?
I mean, we did our creative ideation and we did have one idea on the sticky notes at the end, which was just get rid of all traffic lights. So maybe that's one way at the end of the spectrum. But yeah, I think it would be really interesting to approach this challenge in a slightly different way and think about, is there anything that we're just missing here that we need to think a little bit more counterintuitively to change this? But yeah, we'll have to think about what that could be.
Love it. Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much, both of you, for coming onto the show and talking about what you've done. I just think it's fascinating. I also, and I don't often say this, it's a highly readable report. So we should make that absolutely clear that this is something that even if you don't normally dive into, research sounds like something overly academic. This is rigorous, but it's very much designed to be accessible for people. So I think that's the first point to make, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But as you've illustrated, there's a ton of complexity here. And so I think this is really good for road users to read, but I also think it's really good for compliance people to read. And so thank you for, one, doing it in the first place, but secondly, coming on and sharing it on the show.
Thank you so much for having us.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening, and of course to Ella and Pete for appearing. To find out more about both of them and to read the fascinating research into red light running in London by Cyclists, and to read the fascinating research into cyclists red light running in London, have a look in the show notes. There are links to all of those there, plus, of course, Pete's previous appearance on the podcast. If this is your first time listening to the show, thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major platforms. If you enjoyed the episode, please do leave a review. It really helps other people to discover the show. And of course, I love hearing what you think. To discover episodes of the show that you might have missed, and there are over 300 of them now, visit the show's website, which is humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, and if you're cycling, particularly in London, maybe pause and think twice before rolling through that red. I know I have started to do so. And if you enjoyed this episode, you might also like my Compliance in the Wild video series on LinkedIn. It's a collection of explainer videos that look at real-world interventions. Some are amazing, some not so, that can teach us something about compliance. You can find that at complianceinthewild.com. But in the meantime, stay safe, and remember those red lights are there for a reason. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again very soon on the Human Risk Podcast.